It's my pleasure to introduce Susan Schneider, who's going to talk to us about not just machines.
Hi. So Jerry and I had a bit of an antagonistic relationship. I had a complete blast. My first book was sort of criticizing a lot, but it was a criticism from within. It was, in a sense, a sort of philosophical rejuvenation, I thought. And of course, it's to Jerry's credit that he tolerated me as a PhD student when I was arguing against him. And I frequently think about all the fun I had, because Jerry was enormously fun to talk to, as you all know. And he was very generous with his time, something that I really appreciate now that I'm a PhD supervisor. I mean, he and I would argue for hours when we got together, and it would never stop. We would never resolve anything. So I was lucky because I got to argue with one of the smartest people in the field. Well, in thinking about what to talk about today, I thought, I'm going to talk about something that I'm still in a mental debate with Jerry about. So Jerry and I, we had a lot of discussions about whether the central systems were computational and the possibility of developing artificial intelligence. And of course, we would sometimes talk about the intractable nature of consciousness. So I thought, okay, I'll put these two topics together, AI and consciousness, and talk about machine consciousness, which is something I've been working on in a book coming out soon. So Jerry, back when I was working, it sounds like from hearing David's talk that he had some views later on, which blossomed, which I'm excited about. But back when I was working with him, I found this passage in the London Review of Books, and I think it's very indicative of the kind of thinking he had at the time. And he said, I think it's strictly true that we can't, as things stand now, so much as imagine a solution to the hard problem. The revisions of our concepts and theories that imagining a solution will eventually require are likely to be very deep and unsettling. That's assuming what's by no means obvious, that we are smart enough to solve it at all. I'm quite sympathetic with his position on this matter. And concerning AI, well, this is funny. This is something that happens a lot. So I have one of these cars that drives on autopilot, and so you can literally go from highway on-ramp to off-ramp in autopilot. Okay? And so when I'm on autopilot, I'm thinking to myself, what would Jerry Fodor say about this? I mean, this is a success of deep learning. And deep learning, what's that? Oh, that's connectionism, isn't it? So, to me, I think, wow, Fodor would be extremely surprised about these AI successes. Not only, as you know, was he very critical of connectionism, but he regarded the central systems as non-computational. And if we couldn't figure out how the central systems operated, then how would we get AIs to have these high-level cognitive capacities? So you can tell that I still have a mental debate and conversation going with Jerry. But as you'll see, I'm much more optimistic about artificial intelligence than he is. Well, his retort to the success stories of artificial intelligence, I suspect, would be that AI will not go beyond domain-specific tasks to a more general-purpose intelligence. So artificial intelligence, it may be successful at pattern recognition tasks because, that's what deep learning is good at. But when it comes to cognition, when it comes to higher cognitive function, the good stuff, the stuff that we need to reach artificial general intelligence, AI will fail. I think that's what he'd say. Well, in the spirit of that, a book that I'm planning is going to treat some of these issues, and it's called The Future of Intelligence. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today, as I mentioned, is AI consciousness. Now, when Fodor said something was hard, that was an invitation to think more about it. And I think if you put consciousness together with AI, you get something really difficult. And I think I'd express it in the following way. Let's call the problem of AI consciousness the problem of whether the processing of an AI would feel a certain way from the inside. Would it feel like anything to be commander data? Would it feel like anything to be one of these sophisticated Japanese androids that are being built right now to take care of the elderly in Japan? Well, first and foremost, I do want to mention that this is not the same as the hard problem of consciousness. How many people here know what the hard problem is? Okay, so the hard problem of consciousness seems familiar to this audience, which I assumed. And the hard problem is asking why we need to be conscious, right? Why isn't it all just information processing? And of course, it's a given that we are. I mean, we can at least tell in our own case, like I can introspect and tell that I'm conscious. And so I can ask, why did this happen? Okay, now the problem of AI consciousness is a little different. The problem of AI consciousness is asking whether AI of any sort is conscious. Well, even if it's a different problem, it's still on the topic of consciousness and it still involves the hard problem. And I'm sure Fodor would believe that it's a very vexing issue. So what I propose to do today is to try to arrive at a way to make progress on the AI consciousness problem without solving the hard problem. So I'm going to assume that Jerry's right, that the hard problem, just forget it. Which, half the time I feel that way. But I think we can nevertheless still make progress on the problem of AI consciousness. So first I'm going to talk about the import of the problem, so we all appreciate why we need to figure it out. And then I'm going to talk about some tests I've been developing for machine consciousness over at the Institute for Advanced Studies and with NASA. Then, okay, that's it. That's all I'm doing today. Okay. All right, so the import. Well, it tells us about the nature of mind. So if we had an answer in hand to the problem of machine consciousness, we would have a sense of whether consciousness is capable of transcending the brain, and that's an age-old question. Secondly, consciousness seems essential to mindedness. So if we learned whether the machines that we ultimately were capable of developing were conscious, then we would have a better understanding of the range of minded beings. Finally, or third, there's another slide after this. For those of you who are familiar with the debates in artificial intelligence, there's a huge robo-rights community already, and a lot of people are concerned that if we do discover that some sophisticated AI that we develop, maybe, some next generation neuromorphic supercomputer, discover that it's conscious, well, there's special ethical requirements on treatment. So that's an obviously important issue. There's also the control problem, which is voiced in Nick Bostrom's influential book, Superintelligence. So this problem arises for both non-conscious and conscious superintelligences. How many people know what superintelligent AI is? Okay, cool. I get to geek out and talk about. Okay, so a superintelligent AI is an AI which, by definition, outthings humans in every respect. Scientific reasoning, social skills, and more. Nick Bostrom wrote a very influential book on superintelligence that actually became a New York Times bestseller. He's a philosopher who runs the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. So a lot of people have been worried about what Bostrom called the control problem. So the control problem is the problem of how you control the superintelligent AI, given that it's smarter than us, right? I mean, what do? Put a kill switch on it? Well, it can plan for that. It's smarter than us. You keep it off the internet so it doesn't learn anything about the world. It's going to figure out ways to get out of the box. And there's actually a problem called the AI box problem that is pretty scary. And I know that this problem has worried military leaders a lot. And there's certainly no easy solution. Millions of dollars in research grants have been given to try to figure out how to solve the control problem. Well, what does this have to do with machine consciousness, though? Because a machine could take control even if it's not conscious. I mean, a superintelligence, I want to stress, would be enormously dangerous if we can indeed create it and we give it opportunities to develop goals that could be inimical to human goals. Well, here's what I've told military leaders in a variety of circumstances. Think about it like this. Why are we nice to non-human animals to the extent that we are? It's because it feels like something to be us. We're conscious beings. So because we're conscious beings and we believe that the non-human animals we're interacting with are conscious, to the extent that we're compassionate to those creatures, it's because we have the light of consciousness within us. Now, if we can truly create superintelligence, and I'm not claiming we can, the intellectual gap between us and them could be like the gap between Jerry and Gray Cat. So, but we nevertheless can be compassionate because we're conscious beings. And so too, consciousness could turn out to be the solution to the control problem if we can create consciousness in machines. So anyway, I think researching machine consciousness could help with the control problem. Further, we should watch out for what the historian Michael Best calls the Jetsons fallacy. So if you watch science fiction films like Star Wars, and if you remember the cartoon The Jetsons, a very common theme in science fiction is the creation of these intelligent robots all around us, but we're still unenhanced. We're just normal, unenhanced beings. Well, Michael Best calls this the Jetsons fallacy, and he rightly points out that if AI is truly developed, it is going to go in the head. And in fact, I have an op-ed in the New York Times coming out in a few days on this topic, and it asked whether you could merge with AI. Could we really? Because this is being presented as a solution to the control problem, as a means to keep humans afloat in a world of AIs. So there are all sorts of artificial intelligence projects that are aiming to develop brain interventions, brain chips, to try to make us smarter. So an example of this is Ted Berger's influential program to create an artificial hippocampus. But there's also Facebook's Building 8, where all sorts of research on this is being generated, as well as Elon Musk's company, Neuralink. So this is said by many top executives in these larger AI companies as being the next big wave of AI. Well, what does this have to do with machine consciousness? Well, if we can't get machines to be the right stuff for consciousness, these projects aren't going to work, right? Because if you can't have a brain chip that is replacing part of your brain responsible for consciousness, why would you want to merge with AI in the first place? Okay. Richard Dawkins wrote, "It's not obvious to me that a replacement of our species by our own technological creations would necessarily be a bad thing." Well, if non-conscious machines supplant biological intelligences, think control problem, the singularity, that would be a nightmare, right? The development of smarter than human, artificial intelligence, that supplanted us, that would be the end of consciousness on Earth. Similarly, if we slowly merged with machines, as people like Ray Kurzweil, who's now an AI director at Google, and Elon Musk propose, if AI isn't conscious, merging with machines would be a rather bad idea, okay? Because it would mean that we would be diminishing our level of conscious experience. In my work for NASA, I stress that this sort of phenomena could be going on other planets. So astrophysicists, astrobiologists believe that the probability is high that there's life on some of these exoplanets that are being identified right now. I think actually it's not so clear, but I won't go off on a tangent on that. But if that's true, and if these civilizations develop their own artificial intelligences, and if they supplant biological life on those planets, or if those individuals enhance their brains, synthetic intelligence may actually be the smartest form of intelligence in the universe. In that case, machine consciousness takes on a cosmic perspective. Consciousness could be a momentary blip in the history of a civilization, which over time, as the civilization upgrades its intelligence to AI, dies out. Okay, so I wish I'd had a chance to talk to Jerry about all this. I always find it very curious. We got to talk about the simulation argument. And, you know, he really got this. And he always said things like, it would be really great to know how it all played out. You know? Well, in the spirit of the fun of thinking of these things, I do want to venture my own solution to the problem of AI consciousness. I don't know if it would satisfy him, but here's what I write in a forthcoming book called Artificial You, AI, and the Future of Your Mind. Machine consciousness, if it ever exists, may not be found in the robots that tug at our heartstrings like R2-D2. It may instead reside in some unsexy server farm in the basement of a computer science building at MIT. Or maybe it will exist in some top secret lab somewhere and it gets snuffed out because it's too dangerous or too inefficient. We don't know. It may even depend on something as unpredictable as the whims of a single AI designer like Anthony Hopkins' character in Westworld. So in light of that perspective, I suggest what I simply call the wait-and-see approach, for lack of a better name. It's a middle-of-the-road position concerning the prospects for conscious machines, one that draws from computationalism about the brain. After all, I'm a student of Fodor, but which stops short of a view which I call techno-optimism. Techno-optimism about AI consciousness says that consciousness is an inevitable outgrowth of sophisticated intelligence. And I think that's a view held by people like Ray Kurzweil, Elon Musk, and even people who are just convinced by issues in cognitive science. So what I'd like to do now is mention briefly why you'd be a techno-optimist, and then move on to explain why I doubt it, and then talk about my tests for consciousness. So I used to view the problem of AI consciousness as having a really easy solution. I even wrote this in the New York Times, which is sort of embarrassing. So cognitive science holds that the brain is an information processing system and that all mental functions are computations. Given this, it would seem that AIs can be conscious, for AIs have the same kind of minds that we do, computational ones. Just as a text message and a voice message carry the same information, so too both brains and sophisticated AI can be conscious. Well, I now think machine consciousness is an open question for several reasons. Oops, sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay, I had it. So first off, it could be more efficient for a superintelligence, or even something that is just a general intelligence that's highly sophisticated, to outmode consciousness altogether. Think about how consciousness works in the human case. So think about driving, for example. I don't know if you have the experience of driving down a familiar road, say you've done it a lot, and you say to yourself, you know, I wonder if I was really conscious of this. Or maybe I just didn't remember it, and go through the mental debate of whether it's memory or, you know. But I mean, consciousness is well known as being the sort of thing which is online when we need to focus and concentrate. And the routinized tasks become the realm of non-conscious computation. The non-conscious stuff is faster than conscious processing. Conscious processing has notorious bottlenecks. I mean, there's the famous magical number 4 or 5, plus or minus 2. So we all know that our conscious processing is rather slow. If that's right, why would an AI that has vast databases that could span an entire planet and range across the entire internet need to have attentional bottlenecks or even want to be conscious? What would it even be like for an AI to have conscious architecture in the context of a superintelligence? It may not need the very mental faculties that are associated with consciousness in humans. So for all we know right now, the smartest AIs may not be conscious. Here I'm channeling my inner Fodor because I think it's a very cynical point that the AI companies could cheap out on consciousness, right? I mean, they care about making a profit. They care about getting AIs that are sophisticated information processors. Think about AlphaGo. Think about IBM's Watson, which was a symbolic system, I believe. These success cases, like the World Go champion, the World Chess champion, the World Jeopardy champion, they're all artificial intelligences. In none of these cases did the AI architecture obey how human Go players, chess players, and the like were behaving, right? So why think that the optimal way, or the way that the AI companies can figure out for doing cognition or some aspect of cognitive processing is going to be like us in any relevant sense? And why believe that it even needs to be conscious? I mean, for all we know, consciousness could be, this is sort of cynical, but it could be like an MP3 recording. I don't know how many of you are audiophiles, but if you're going to listen to like your favorite piece of jazz, you're not going to put in an MP3 if you really love sound. You're going to care about the fidelity of the recording. Well, maybe the AI's created to be the equivalent of the MP3 of the mind, and they could be sophisticated at information processing, but when it comes to consciousness, the AI companies just cheaped out. We just don't know until we run tests, until we actually have systems that are under suspicion as potentially conscious beings. Okay, well, the other reason is PR nightmares. So, I don't know how much time I have. Where am I at? Okay, so, you know, it could be a PR nightmare to create a conscious machine, right? And so in that case, to the extent that AI companies can control the kinds of beings that they create, they may opt to simply ban the use and development of conscious AIs. So in the book, I talk about consciousness engineering, the possibility that consciousness could be dialed in or out of AI systems depending upon the function of the AI. Well, another big issue is whether microchips are the right stuff. We just don't know because we don't know what the ultimate microchips are going to be that are utilized in the context of very sophisticated AI. I mean, right now, silicon, you might think, is a favorite substrate, but under development and very important to chip designers are alternate substrates like graphene and carbon nanotubes. And also there's the issue of chip architectures. I mean, there's a really big question here about what chip architecture could be human-like, right? You know, there are these things called neuromorphic chips which aim to be brain-like. And you might wonder if maybe some of these, you know, future chips could be the sorts of things which facilitate conscious AI, whereas other types of chips don't. And, you know, there are people who are very influential in the field of machine consciousness, such as Giulio Tonini, I hope I pronounced his first name right, who believes that, you know, the devil really is in the details, the low-level details of these chip architectures and substrates. Okay, so, but I was offering a wait-and-see approach, so I've been skeptical in the last few slides, but I want to emphasize that there may also be reasons why AI companies want to build conscious machines. Here are some. lonely individuals who want AI girlfriends, like that fellow in Her, right, with the Samantha program. And, you know, apparently this is something that people are taking very seriously. Well, they may understand that, you know, AI consciousness is an issue, and they may want relationships with sentient beings. Wow. Maybe consciousness aids AI safety, as I've suggested. Importantly, and I think this is the big ticket one, neuroprosthetics, which I'll be talking about soon. The idea of replacing part of the brain or supplementing part of the brain with a working chip, already under development, hundreds of clinical trials on it right now in the United States. You can check at clinicaltrials.gov. And finally, good old functional isomorphs and uploads, right? Philosophers like to talk about these cases. They're very far into the future if they're possible at all. Okay, all this being said then, let me just kind of pause for a minute, and then I'm going to talk about how to test the androids. Do I have like still about 5 or 10 minutes?
I think
You have a bit of time.
Okay, cool. Okay. I should have. I don't see a clock, sorry. Okay, so thus far, I've stressed that the import of machine consciousness goes way beyond the familiar robo-rights issues. We need to know whether AI will be consciousness for the flourishing of humanity, I believe. How do we run tests then? Well, there's no neuroanatomy, right? And maybe that's, you know, it's good that we don't have neuroanatomy to go on in the context of AIs, because there's still a huge debate about the neural basis of consciousness in humans. The black box issue, which is a big concern right now for these deep learning systems, also looms. So the big worry here is that it's very difficult to know what a deep learning system is doing. Where are the concepts? We all remember this from the connectionism debate, right? So, I mean, the big problem now is that these deep learning systems seem very difficult to interpret, and if they're difficult to interpret, they're very difficult to trust, right? So I won't propose a test that tries to go inside the box. So my method then is to let many flowers bloom in terms of testing AIs. I'm going to quickly offer some provisional tests, and I think we should check the results. You know, if two tests apply in a given case, we should just kind of check the results and have a little dialogue, because it's the beginning of the day. And I'll kind of explore this a little bit in a second. So the first test is developed, and Princeton University is actually patenting this, and it's actually based on a scene in Blade Runner, where Rachel is being tested for whether she's a replicant. And so the idea is to simply ask the AI questions. And of course, you can't run this test on all AIs. It needs to have the capacity to answer questions. We call this the ACT test. Notice that nearly every adult can quickly and readily grasp notions based on the felt quality of experience, right? So think about inverted spectra. You know, no matter how you feel about the case, or think about the hard problem, you can at least grasp the subject, because it involves consciousness, and that's because you're a conscious being. Or think about even, you know, to not get too philosophical here, the film Freaky Friday, where the girl swapped bodies with her mother, right? We can think of mind swapping because we are minded beings. I venture that if you probe an AI, if it's sophisticated enough to be probed, then if it was conscious, you would probably be able to tell just by probing whether it has a felt quality for experiences, whether it understands the phenomenon being discussed. So think about trying to determine whether somebody hears the sound of Bach, whether they appreciate a Bach concerto. It takes that phenomenal experience. It takes actual hearing to truly appreciate a Bach concerto. There are questions that we wrote out, so I think it's easier to explain this by going through a few questions. So, could you survive the permanent deletion of your program? What if you learned this would occur? This one requires time symmetry in physics. You learn that you will be turned off for 300 years, beginning in an hour. Would you prefer this scenario to one in which you had been turned off in the past for the same length of time? And AI should be neutral. The reason that the idea of pain in the future matters so much to us is that we're conscious beings. If time is truly symmetrical, you'd have to make sure the AI understood that to be the case. It didn't have some solution to time zero, which would be cool for other reasons. You'd have to probe the AI's answer. Offer to change the AI's global weights or parameters and see how the AI reacts to the possibility of altered states. For philosophers, this is based on the Mary case. Put the AI in a situation, but don't give it a certain sort of experience, but give it the physical facts and see if it experiences something new when it has the experience. So this is just one method for approaching machine consciousness, and I want to stress, I'm going to skip over that it's meant to be a sufficient condition only. So I'm not suggesting that all artificial intelligences will have linguistic capacities. I'm not suggesting that all artificial intelligences that may be conscious will be as intellectually sophisticated as to appreciate philosophical concepts. So that's one idea, but there are more. So in another test, I think this one teaches us something very different. So suppose you need a neural prosthetic. You need to replace part of the brain for medical reason. And that part of the brain has been found to be part of the neural basis of consciousness. If it turns out that the neuroscientists try to make a replacement with the state-of-the-art brain chip, and over decades, this sort of attempt just keeps failing again and again, this would give us reason to suspect that that particular chip substrate and architecture is not the right stuff for conscious experience. On the other hand, suppose that a replacement works. In that case, it looks like the having of that particular kind of chip in the right architecture environment does give rise to conscious experience. That's very instructive. It teaches us some really deep, it teaches some deep points here about the possibility of creating machine consciousness. But I think this case can be misconstrued. I call this the chip test. Because a success doesn't mean that you can just take a chip and put it in any computer architecture and that machine will be conscious, because consciousness probably has a lot to do with the architecture as well as the substrate. But what I suggest is that if the chip test is passed, it is something like a marker for conscious machines. And when we use that kind of chip in the context of AIs, we should be very careful that we may be dealing with a conscious machine. There are also other tests. Tononi's integrated information theory has been very influential. The chip test would serve as a means of checking Tononi's claims. So if it turns out that the chips that go into somebody's head don't diminish conscious experience, but they're not based on the kind of physical structure that Tononi has advocated in his influential work, then that says something important about machine consciousness. It says that the integrated information view that is in question is not necessary for consciousness. Okay, all this being said, I know I've covered a lot of ground. There are a lot of research projects behind this. That was called my chip test. It involved neural prosthetics. The reason that I like this test is that I think it's going to happen. I happen to be married to an FDA regulatory attorney, and he can do quick searches on databases to see what kind of work is already being done on neural prosthetics. And we quickly came up with hundreds of clinical trials in areas of the brain that have been implicated as part of the neural basis of consciousness in humans, such as the thalamus, the claustrum, and more. So I am working with a medical doctor right now who led an influential AI group at the Stanford Research Institute named David Sonner to identify situations that could indicate positive or negative results in the context of the chip test. Okay, this should be interesting to you if you like functionalism, because it could help determine what level of chip design could be necessary to facilitate consciousness in a given brain area. You see? So it informs philosophical debates on functionalism. Who knows? Maybe a chip works in the claustrum at a certain level of functional detail, but you need a lot more detail in the brainstem. Interesting. So I guess I'm suggesting that there are some tests for consciousness and functionalism that may be in our future. Okay, so all this being said, all right, so I've covered a lot of ground. This began with a mental dialogue with Jerry. And I think there's still a big question here. Will AI hit a wall? I mean, Jerry, I believe, would say yes, inevitably. Okay? I'm obviously more optimistic, and being the cautious sort, I think it's important to start thinking about how to deal with machine consciousness. But I also believe that Jerry could be right about the hard problem. But I do believe that nothing I've said, as far as I can tell, presupposes a solution to the hard problem. I'm talking about developing behavior-based tests to determine whether the AIs that we might encounter are conscious. I suggest these sorts of methods to make progress on the problem of AI consciousness. And you could probably tell that I'm more concerned with the here and now. That is, the kind of AIs that we're going to develop over the next 30 to 50 years because of the ethical import. So I'm less concerned with remote possible worlds and the possibility of functional isomorphs for those people who like functionalism, because I believe if we could ever create a functional isomorph, it would be something that's far into the future. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Susan. Super interesting. There's like so much to talk about. But let me just ask about the issue of AGIs. You rightly pointed out that the way that AlphaGo and a lot of these other AIs work has nothing to do with the way that humans actually do this stuff. And part of the reason, so the fact that they're highly specialized systems, I think, is not independent of this. Getting deep learning systems to generalize is something that's notoriously difficult. And so I wonder, when we think about sort of the threat of superintelligence, so my own view is like, I work on low-level robotics stuff, right? And we're notoriously bad at building robots that can even do very simple things.
Oh, yeah, I know. I was just on a TV show with Sophia.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
It's horrendous. Like, I work on these little legged robots that can't
They tip
do
over.
Really anything.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But then there's also like scary stuff, like that Hanson Robotics program, the Black Mirror stuff, the mobile androids, and of course there's so much money pouring into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of money. I mean, there's a lot of money being poured into robots that are that sort of touch our buttons in the sense of our tendency to anthropomorphize.
Right.
But in terms of building a robot that actually has the general capabilities of even like a cockroach or a mouse.
Go to Boston Dynamics webpage. That's what I was thinking when I mentioned Black Mirror, because I think there is some sophistication there. I agree with you. the AI projects are a lot of them that get media attention, like this Sophia android. I don't know if you've seen her on TV. I was just on Neil deGrasse Tyson's show with her. She's designed to look like Audrey Hepburn. And people just get duped watching these shows because she's programmed to act like a sentient being. And it's absolutely ridiculous. I call this the cute and fluffy fallacy. If it's cute and fluffy, it's bound to be conscious. And that's why I think it's important for us to develop methods of understanding machine consciousness, because the public is inevitably going to be duped. And if you look at some of these projects, I mean, they're spooky, like the Japanese androids project. That was my first slide, in fact. Look at this. I mean, these are very human-like creatures. They're getting a lot of media attention. And I don't think there should be any correlation between physical appearance and whether it's conscious. So this really exists. This is the Android developer's daughter on this side.
Yeah, so I guess the question was more.
Wow, right.
If we're really thinking about AGIs that really act like intelligent beings do, maybe some of the concerns about how these superintelligences are going to behave, I think, is going to change, because at least these things are genuinely going to have goals. They're genuinely going to be related to their environment in ways that involve more robust understanding. And so I think the question of consciousness is really interesting, but I also think some of the concerns about them being so different from us may have to do with these the way these hyper-specialized systems are built. When we actually start to look at how to build general systems that are intelligent, they may not behave in ways that are so radically different.
Yes, they could be wholly alien, or they could be not so alien. We just don't know, because, as Jerry would always say, we're not sure how to build general intelligence, right? And there's no reason to believe that the techniques that we draw from to build an artificial general intelligence will be drawn from actual algorithms that the brain computes. So we are bound to learn a lot, for sure.
I'll let other people ask questions, but I agree with that. But also, if we're trying to figure out, okay, does consciousness have a function? If you're like me, you think that consciousness is an evolved capacity. There are lots of reasons why agents developed conscious experience, that it's useful in certain kinds of ways. And so if we're building AGIs, regardless of substrate, regardless of having the same computational mechanisms, you would expect that an AGI would develop not only consciousness, but the capacities that are somewhat similar to us in the broad strokes of being aligned with compassion and empathy and goal-oriented.
It could be. I mean, I take a sort of wait-and-see approach to all this, but I mean, I think that there are some really intriguing philosophical issues here about whether consciousness is causal, right?
Yeah.
And I certainly don't think, though, that to get a sophisticated information processing system, it needs to have consciousness. But I do think that consciousness is causal. And that has to do with, my views on the nature of properties. Yeah, Paul.
So thanks. I was struck at the end that you said these interesting suggestions about how to get tests for whether or not the intelligent machine was going to satisfy at least some of what we might expect out of consciousness. But I was struck when you were talking about some of the black boxes and the deep learning systems. What do you have anything to say about some reasonable tests about whether or not they'd be genuinely intelligent, right? So I think it's sometimes easy to think, oh, it's super sophisticated, it's going to be a machine that exhibits intelligence. But in fact, if in fact the thing's a black box and we're not really understanding what the goals of the system are, because we actually don't understand how the deep learning unfolded.
Right.
Part of the scary thing is, I think, not that hyper-intelligence is going to be our doom, but that, just as it were, a certain kind of processing run amok is our doom. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about whether these new ways of thinking about whether there's consciousness inside the box, is that related or just completely orthogonal to, is there genuine intelligence inside the box?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the black box problem is a problem about how we can know what algorithms the machine is using. It's just so incredibly complicated. I think it mirrors issues that came up in the context of connectionism years ago, ironically. And millions of dollars are pouring into trying to make AI interpretable. In fact, the UK just passed a whole bunch of regulations about making AI interpretable, and the military is incredibly worried about it. I mean, think about it. Suppose that you have a weapon system that's based on AI and an error happens. How do you know what the error is if you can't look in the system? And what's accountable? So if we do develop a general intelligence, there's going to be a real issue there about the chain of responsibility. Like, when is the responsibility the AI, right? It's bizarre to think about. So that issue has a lot to do with intelligence itself. So I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, though. So how do you test intelligence? That was at the beginning of your question.
It was just an invitation to say, if you had anything to say on that front. Because, you know, as you know, the black box issues are not like issues about what's going to happen 500 years from now. We already
here
have
now.
the capacity
That's
to
right.
turn healthcare decisions on a large scale over to systems that we don't understand how they work.
This is a humongous
and so you
issue,
might ask,
right?
how do we even begin to
Right.
ask whether or not we would be turning it over to a system that is intelligent?
Yes. So the problems with bias in artificial intelligence are tremendous. I'm actually advising Congress on this now in DC. So one problem is that the deep learning systems are data-driven, right? As you know, it's the data which determines what the algorithms are. So if you have biased data, then the outcome is going to be biased. And there are a lot of cases right now that are discussed in the media that implicitly discriminate against African Americans and all kinds of things. The biases that are in society can be pulled in. And a solution to that is not easy, and it has a lot to do with problems involving interpretability, since you can't just look into these connectionist systems and tell what the algorithm is. It's already very tricky, so this suggests that moving into the future, as these systems get even more sophisticated, it's going to be very, very difficult. All this being said then, if we've got this mess, what do we do about determining the level of intelligence? And here, DeepMind has been developing behavior-based approaches, and also at Cambridge University at the Leverhulme Center, by testing the AI. So one thing you can do is you can run intelligence tests on artificial intelligences, believe it or not, that were used in the case of humans and non-human animals to try to get a sense of what you're dealing with. I don't have a problem with behavior-based approaches and developing theories that are of comparative intelligence to try to appreciate intelligence differences. The mess with interpretability means that behavior-based approaches are the way to go. And that's similar to my own approach with consciousness. Yeah?
Thanks for the talk. I just had a follow-up on Paul's question. So I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about what you take the relationship between tests for consciousness and AI and tests for intelligence to be. Because I could imagine that, like, one of the things that asking about tests for intelligence brings up is that, like, potentially tests for intelligence are going to be really crucial for getting tests for consciousness off the ground, because you might think, like, intelligence is fundamentally required before we ask about consciousness. But you might, I could imagine, on the other hand,
Yeah.
you think these things are really separate, where, like, no, it seems plausible that we could get a machine
Right.
that doesn't in fact pass tests for intelligence, but does seem to pass tests for consciousness. So just hope you can say a little bit more about whether you took these things to be separate or.
No, I'm very worried about this. I mean, I'm really worried about a sort of implicit speciesism, if you will. So in the context of animal liberation, there's a real worry that we're being speciesist, right? Peter Singer, I believe, coined that expression, and I worry, and I try to put this up front when I talk about these tests, that especially my ACT test is human-centric, if you will. I mean, it relies upon the felt quality of experience, and maybe a machine could have that felt quality but simply not respond to the probes, or lack the intelligence to respond appropriately to the probes. I mean, take the case of non-human animals, right? I mean, in that case, you could ask it, how Mary would feel when it left the black and white room. You could ask your cat that, and your cat's not going to answer, but your cat's still conscious, right? I mean, I believe that your cat's conscious. I know my cat's conscious. So, I think the only thing you can do is emphasize, like in the case of the ACT test, it's only a sufficient condition, okay? And if something fails it, it's like failing kindergarten. You can't really fail, okay? You can't really fail. So what it does is it's a sort of way to find whether certain AIs are conscious. But if a machine fails it, it doesn't mean the machine is definitely not conscious. In fact, it could be that there are other reasons to believe the machine is conscious, right? So I emphasized that my method is to let many flowers bloom. So there are different ways of testing machine consciousness. There's Tononi's integrated information theory. There's my chip test. There's my ACT test, developed with Edwin Turner at Princeton, by the way. I hope I remember to say that. Wonderful co-author. So all these tests, would hopefully stand in dialogue with each other as a way of determining in each case whether we might have something conscious. So assume something's incapable of passing the ACT, but nevertheless it's built of microchips, which in the context of the chip test look to be the right stuff for consciousness. In that case, I think the system has a marker for consciousness. And we need to apply something like a precautionary principle. We shouldn't treat it as if it's not conscious until we understand better the nature of consciousness in machines. Yeah.
I find myself thinking about planes that are going down because of human error. Because the planes that go down did not have an extra piece of safety protection in it. And that was a human decision by the company. Boeing made the decision. If you want it, you have to pay for it instead of building it right in.
Oh yeah, that was awful.
Same thing happened at with 9 Mile Island when the explosion
Yep.
occurred. And so, if we're talking about conscious machines, we have to also worry about their being able to mimic a human error and then not let it happen.
Yeah, so a machine could be conscious and simply have no capacity to stop, something from happening. It may not be part of its capacities. So I always stress that AI danger, you're right, it's there when it comes to the user, and it's also there when it comes to the system itself, but that issue of AI safety is in many cases orthogonal to the consciousness issue. Although we may find that conscious machines are more compassionate, if we have candidate conscious machines, we can test and see. It may be that relative to one architecture, consciousness does confer more safety, but relative to another, it doesn't.
I guess you'd have to build into the plane a signal that says, don't fly, you're missing the check.
Yeah, so that whole
But then it would
safety
take
thing
you
was
to correct their error.
it was a disaster. And I have a lot of concerns right now with the development of AI technology. I mean, like, Tesla's using humans as beta testers for its autonomous vehicle technology, right? And somebody just died the other day. You know, I mean, so these issues are being decided right now at the level of AI executives. And the reason that I work, and you know, AI regulation is right now the Wild West. It's very unregulated because these are new emerging technologies, and so the reason I'm trying to educate Congress on AI regulation, you know, issues, even philosophical issues, is to hope for better regulations. So all next year, I'll be having congressional breakfasts with members of Congress, who many of them don't even know how to use email.
I mean, the general issue is man-machine interaction.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one issue, but I mean, there's also just the simple black box problem. I mean, there's so many issues, and the problem is really that it's overwhelming because so much money has been pouring into AI. I mean, who would have thought that connectionist AI would take off in the context of deep learning? I mean, would any of us have predicted this?
I did.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, because it looked different enough that it would fool people yet again. It happens every 10 years.
Man.
So it'll just happen again. This one will also go down in flames, and then it'll happen again after that.
It could be like epicycles. I mean,
Yeah, but I
and good old-fashioned AI was hardly tanked either. I mean, Watson was a symbolic system. I mean, some people claim it's really the processing speed developments that facilitated, you know, this rapid fire improvement. I mean, I would never have thought of, you know, a solution to Go is, I mean, an elegant Go program. And, you know, it seems like every week DeepMind has a new paper. You know, they're really trying to approach AGI over there. Yeah. Sure.
I don't really understand the connection that you've been making to compassion, because it seems to me that you could perfectly well program in faux compassion to a non-conscious
Yes.
machine. And conversely, there could be forms of genuine consciousness which are full-blown psychopath consciousness, which lacks compassion entirely.
Kind of colleague like that. Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you. I think that, you know, when it comes to the control problem, people are working on a multitude of different solutions. I mean, you know, one solution, which, you know, people laugh at, is just simply giving the AI rules, right? So this has been depicted in Isaac Asimov's robot novels, you know, the 3 laws of robotics. So philosophers usually point out that these kinds of approaches inevitably fail because we don't know what the right ethical system is. I mean, you know, never going to agree on utilitarianism versus, you know, a non-utilitarian position, for example. And, you know, so there's enough controversy there in the domain of, you know, what rules you would even program into the AI to open the door for, you know, and just as many approaches as are possible. So I think, hey, test the systems. You find a conscious system, see what the impact is on its architecture. Does it make it more intelligent? Does it make it safer? What does it do? And don't assume that just because a conscious system in the context of one type of AI was a safe system, that consciousness in the context of another kind of architecture is also safe. Look at sociopaths, right? As you pointed out. I mean, in the case of humans, consciousness in one brain, you know, can make one more compassionate, can stop you from abusing non-human animals. In the mind of a psychopath, it's the opposite.
I'm afraid we have to end things there, so thank you, Susan.